Welcome to the Tomorrow Today podcast, mapping the future of business. My name is Buhle, and it's great to have you join us again as we map the future of business. This episode is the second half of the conversation about the future of organizational design. So if you haven't listened to episode 2 yet, please pause right now and go and do that. In this episode, we will be looking back in history and try to make sense of the future, especially why bionic organizational design is so important. I am joined, as always, by my colleague, Graeme Codrington. Graeme, how are you this week?
Well, I'm really excited because for the first time on the Tomorrow Today podcast, we are actually together. You won't pick that up if you're just listening to us. I suppose if you watch the YouTube recording that we make available, we're in the same space, which is great. You are normally in Canada in your studio. I am in Johannesburg in my studio, and you are with me today. But it's nice to be in person, but you're more relaxed, I think, than just being in my studio. You're relaxed because I did all the work for this episode, I think, eh?
Well, Graeme, it was just 2 interviews you did. It's not like you were carrying the whole thing, but I've got some great insights to share as well as we look at organizational design in a bit more detail again this week. This episode is packed full of great insights, especially as we look at the interview that we have with one of our Tomorrow Today colleagues. So, Graeme, you had this interview with Keith Coates. And so let's listen as Keith talks about the framework for understanding where we are now and what happens next with how organizational design is structured into the future.
Keith, thanks so much for joining us here on the podcast. I know that as we are trying to help people think about what the organization of the future might look like, it's probably a useful thing to look back to the past. I know this is something that you enjoy doing with all the dangers of oversimplifying history. But tell us a little bit about Jensen's model of how companies have and organizations and people have developed over time.
You know, Graeme, there's a great quote by a British statistician, George Box, who says, all models are wrong, some are useful. So I think we'll preface it with that. But Jensen's model is certainly useful. And what it essentially does, he wrote it up in a book called The Dream Society, is that he goes back and looks at various economic eras. The first era he looks at, and this is obviously a very high-level overview and a broad swath of the landscape, is the hunter-gatherer era. And he looks at what were the conditions prevalent to the hunter-gatherer era, how did you create a competitive advantage there, and in short, the competitive advantage went to the strongest. Then he looks at what causes the transition and
Before you move on, so just so people understand the model, he's looking at saying if you've got an organizing principle, I mean, that's what we're looking at in this episode of the podcast, is your organizing principle is to work out what's going to be successful at this moment in time, right? And so
Correct.
He's saying that back in the day, and it's only one model. This isn't a comprehensive view of human history, but there was a time in human history where, for the majority of organizations, as in tribes or clans or groups of people, the organizing feature that was likely to give you the most success was who was physically the strongest. That then influenced who became leaders in that environment. You proved your leadership mettle, if you like, by literally beating the other people up, by proving that you had what it took to be competitive in that era. And then you can obviously tell larger stories around that. But that's the basis of Jensen's model. Is that correct?
No, exactly. So then you transition into what he calls the agrarian society, and now it was about land ownership. So the leaders in that context were whoever owned the land. And the competitive advantage in that context was what you got out of your land. So how you, to use a more modern colloquialism, how you sweated your chief asset, which was your land. And those who understood subsistence farming and practiced it created a competitive advantage for themselves in that particular context. The next transition was to one that was a little bit more familiar now, because the legacy of this next era still sits with us today. It's almost as if it's cast a long shadow to the present day. And that, of course, is the Industrial Revolution, the industrial era. And here, the competitive advantage was forged by efficiency. So how efficient you could, how you could build efficiencies into whatever it was you did. The leadership went to those who owned the businesses, the educated. And so what's important as we go through this model, Graeme, is to understand that what gave you competitive advantage in the previous era doesn't fall away. It becomes necessary, but not sufficient. So you still need to practice it, but by keep doing it, you no longer create a competitive advantage. And at this point, it's really interesting, because how many companies today, when their backs are against the wall, feel like if only they could increase their efficiency, that would be enough. And very often it's not enough. Obviously, you have to be efficient to be in the game, but it's not enough.
But it's not enough. And so then let's also then overlay our theme again of organizational design, which includes ownership and structures. If you go back and have a look at the agrarian economy, maybe the best way to think about that was in the feudal system, where you had one person who sort of owned the land, and you say sweat their assets. I mean, literally, they had people working in the environment, sometimes in slavery, sometimes in a feudal system. But it was basically that you had this landowner who, in many cases, wasn't the person doing the job. They just owned the capital, the means of production, but they weren't physically involved. That then became the foundation for the industrial era, because you had these capital owners who owned the factories, who owned the organizations, and they then told everybody what to do. And that is the basis of capitalism, as we know it today. But as you say, that's brought into today. I'd go further with an example, Keith, and I'd say after COVID now, where a lot of companies are struggling to keep up the productivity and efficiency, what's their default setting? Control. They literally, the land, the building that they own, they say to their people, you must come back to the land. You must come back to the office, so that we can control you. This is not the words they use, but genuinely, I think 80 or 90% of companies having a return to office policy, it's because they've gone backwards in their organizational thinking to controlling the physical place of production, back to the agrarian mindset, and then also this industrial mindset of efficiency is the ultimate competitive advantage. If everybody's and then efficiency requires control as well. Yeah. So that's why I wanted to chat to you, because for me, I think there's echoes of Jensen's big sweep of history in where we find ourselves today.
Well, just on that point, the sad thing is this, that is, if you want to build a truly adaptive organization, you should relinquish control. So by exercising control, in your example, everyone's got to go back to the office, you are actually contributing directly to building an organization that is not adaptable. And we won't get sidetracked by that. Maybe that's another conversation. But this is critical, because if you truly want an adaptive organization, it's about giving control. And obviously that's a bigger conversation, what that looks like. But here's the
Keith,
irony. Is that,
yeah. No, absolutely.
Yeah,
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you, because you're a master of the craft. If people want to hear more about adaptive leadership, stick around. Keith's coming back for a whole episode with us on the podcast to talk about that. So nice teaser there, Keith. But let's not interrupt Jensen's model, right? We've got to the industrial era. What happens next?
So then we go into what is the information era. And I think most organizations understand this, the age of having access to big data. And here's the distinction, is that for a lot of companies, they thought that merely having access to it was sufficient. But so they would bolt on their IT systems. It would not always work that well. It's no longer having access to it. It's about how you use it. And let me pick on the banking industry here, because, I mean, they're a classic example. Under a mindset of efficiencies, what banks traditionally did structurally is they siloed themselves. So you have mortgage, you have private, you have, you have all these different silos within banks to create efficiencies. Now we are living in a connected society, an integrated society, and banks really struggle to offer a coherent service because their silos don't always speak to each other and they can't use their information that they've got. And when you think about the information that a bank has on the individual, it's incredible. They can't really use it efficiently to bring their service and product. So again, we're talking very high level, but perhaps it's a very worthwhile example. So in the information era, Graeme, it was all around information, not just merely having it, but obviously how you used it to tailor your service and product to your client.
In that era,
Yeah.
what then? Because I think a lot of our clients are still struggling to get into the digital or information era. I think that would be a great step forward for some of our clients. What would the leadership model in that space be? Because if information, which is more than data, so it's about this connected information, it's about information that adds value and insight. What would the leadership model be that would give you the competitive advantage from the information age?
Well, it would start to be, and you can track this in leadership literature, it would start to be the emergence of a far more participative leadership model. Because if you understand that you need to give control, you give control by being a more participative leader. And in the organization, the question then to ask is who has the information and who needs to act on it. And very often in a traditional control-filled organization, the people at the coalface who are facing the clients get the information, know what needs to be done, but they don't have the authority. They've got to get sign-off. And by the time it goes through the various hierarchical nature of the organization, the opportunity is lost. So leadership starts to understand in this context that it needs to be more participative. It needs to default authority down the organization to those who have the information. That's how that would tie.
Yeah, and for me, a great example that just gets people thinking about it is asking how much democracy you have in your workplace. Not that democracy is the ultimate form of governance. I think it was Churchill who said democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. But in a workplace, why do we not get to vote for who our manager will be? If your manager leaves or retires or whatever, why don't you vote for that? Why don't we have transparency of various things? Information is held by senior leaders who then send instructions down the system. And if we are saying that the information age is already 50 years old, but the organizational systems that were supposed to develop because the information age is the basis, those haven't even developed yet. Hopefully people begin to see the problem that we're seeing.
Well, I think it's nuanced, and it's a great landscape to navigate because it's nuanced by who's in the workplace. As a younger generation comes in, as we know full well, they have opinions, they're used to sharing them. So there's a demographic influence here when it comes to the kind of organizations that today you need to build. Another good example, and again, there's always a danger naming specific companies, but it's the mindset that excites me, is Netflix. So they have a policy around leave, which simply is 2 words: take some. And they trust that their staff will know how much to take. It's very similar to TomorrowToday, Graeme. As you know, we've never put in a leave policy. We believe that people in our organization will be responsible enough, and sometimes we have to encourage them to take some. The other interesting policy around Netflix was how they use their money. And they started out with a line that said, use our money as if it were your own. And that didn't work quite well. It's quite a funny story because some people believe they're entitled to fly first class and eat at 5-star restaurants, and that's how they would use their money. So that didn't work so well. So they wrote it back and changed it ever so slightly to say, use our money as if in our best interest. So the check question is this in Netflix's best interest? So, you can start to play with fundamentals that give control away to responsible people. Now, this then comes back to the work of Dave Marquette, where if you want to talk about giving control, you have to look at what he did, a nuclear submarine commander in the US Navy. And he says this is only possible when 2 things are in place. that people understand what your company is about. They have a clear understanding of the direction and the vision and the mission you want to accomplish. And the second thing is that they're competent. If you have those two building blocks in place, they know what the company is about and they are competent, you can and ought to give away control. And that starts to chime in with the changes now that in the information era, given the information we've got, the need for speed, why we need to start fundamentally building different organizations. And that translates into leadership.
Some people listening to us talking here are probably going to think it's going to stretch them to get to what we've just been talking about. But we're suggesting that that's already in the past, that if you want to be a future-focused organization, there's at least one more step. So take us there.
And that one more step is to what Jensen calls the connection or relational economy, where now your competitive advantage is not just around building business efficiency. It's not just around using your information smartly to customize your approach, but now it's understanding that relationship is the key. And I came across a lovely metaphor the other day, and I'm kind of calling it the Copernicus principle, if you like. Before Copernicus came around, we believed that the Earth revolved around, the sun revolved around the Earth. And obviously after Copernicus, we understood we'd got it completely wrong, that in fact, the Earth revolves around the sun. Apply that to sort of customer service. For many big companies, they believe that their clients revolve around them, that they're the sun. Smart companies in a relational economy understand that their clients are the sun around which they revolve. And their clients have got lots of options, lots of choices. Why would I choose your product or service? And in that context, relationship then becomes key. Just yesterday, I had a conversation with one of Africa's largest IT firms that we're going to be doing work for soon. And their brief to me was, how do we help our sales force understand the importance of relationship, that they can't just treat all their clients with a one-size-fits-all, that they've got to get out from behind their desks and go and have coffee, in their words, or make the call. And it was just interesting that that's what they're needing to do with salespeople to help them understand the importance of relationship. And so in the connection economy, your competitive advantage is relationship and basically answering the question, why should that client buy my service or product when they've got so much choice? Let me just quickly give you one lovely story that I think sums up everything about these transitions. And it comes from a Turkish sage. I read it the other day by the name of Nasruddin Hoxha. And he tells the story in the first person. I don't for 1 minute believe it happened to him, but that's how he tells it. So I'll communicate it like that. He talks about losing his wedding ring one night in the basement of his house when it was dark. And he spent ages in the basement looking for this lost wedding ring. He can't find it. So he goes outside into the street and continues his search under a street lamp. And a neighbor comes across and says, "What are you doing?" And he explains why he's out in the street. And the neighbor asks the question in your mind, well, what on earth are you doing looking here when you clearly lost it? And the answer was, this is where the light is. And I find that a really delightful metaphor for a lot of endeavor by companies today, that is sincere endeavor, but they're looking entirely in the wrong place. Because you see, this is where the light is. This is what they know. This is what they've always done. This is what they think is but they need to get into that dark basement. But it's much easier standing out in the street under the light than going into that dark basement. And so, again, I think when it comes to the subject of what is the organizational structure that will succeed today, what is the competitive frontier, it might be for many of the people listening to this podcast about going into that dark basement. It's not inviting. It's a little bit scary. We don't have much light there, but that's where we need to do. That's where we need to find the light, because that's where the lost wedding ring is.
Thanks, Keith. I knew it would be worth chatting to you. We're going to put a link in the show notes to something you wrote a number of years ago about this model from Jensen. We recommend his book, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. It's really worth reading, even though it's, I think, probably a decade or two old now. He calls it the dream society. It's more than that. It's a connection economy. It's a way of thinking differently about the world, which then needs to influence how we think about our organizations differently. So Keith, thanks again.
Pleasure. Thank you. Nice chatting, Graeme.
It sounds like most of the organizations I know are more like the industrial era system you are describing, and maybe trying to get to just the information era.
No, Buhle, that's exactly what I got out of the interview with Keith as well. That Jensen model was something I remembered a while back. Keith uses it more regularly than I do. And in my head, I was thinking, I think companies are a bit stuck in an old system. I didn't realize they were stuck in a system that's already 50 years out of date. And I think you're exactly right. My experience, I think your experience, our team's experience with different clients is that, as Keith was saying, especially under pressure, people default back to a more industrial controlling mindset. And they haven't even unpacked the value and benefit of being in the information and digital age yet, let alone the connection economy.
That's very concerning, because when you think about leaders, I don't think our leaders, we don't like to think of ourselves as dinosaurs. We like to think of ourselves as being, future focused and forward looking in the way that we do things. So I guess it's important then to think about some of the redefinitions that leaders need to pay attention to now for the future of organizational design. And I think in this episode, in the previous episode, we've really covered quite a lot, and also in your interview with Keith. But as we look further, what are some of the other key aspects that we need to be thinking about? And I think we're just going to highlight about 3 of them in this episode.
Yeah, we could talk forever actually on this one. So we're trying to keep this podcast episode down to something manageable. But I like the 3 points that we've pulled out. So maybe let's dive straight in. I know the first point is one that you're passionate about. It's being bionic.
Absolutely. So when we're thinking about rethinking technology and rethinking how we work, it has then to start with thinking about being bionic. And so what do we actually mean, about this? And I think the organization of the future is going to be, and it needs to be, bionic by design rather than by accident. And so when you think about the whole history of work and organizational design that we have just been looking at, leading to this point where human capacity is maximized and augmented by technology. We've always had technology, and I think technology is one of the ways that we have advanced when we think about the different eras of working and of organizations. But what is different about where we find ourselves now is that the way we structure and the way that we work. And so when we talk about bionic business, we're talking about an integration of human capabilities with advanced technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics. And I think often with so much noise about artificial intelligence right now, the other aspects of the technologies that are going to help us augment our capacity as humans are being forgotten. It's not just artificial intelligence, it's also machine learning and all the others that are actually taking us forward.
But for me, this was the value of being reminded of that model from Jensen by Keith, is because there's a danger of confusing the tools with the competitive advantage.
Yes.
And so in each of the previous eras, if you focused only on the tools that were available, and you thought, well, the tool is the thing that's going to set us up for success, that's going to make things easier, that's going to give us competitive advantage, you would have missed what was actually going on. The tool just enabled the change that took place. And this is one of the things that I think people are missing at the moment.
And Graeme, and I think therein lies some of the challenges that are making it difficult for people to think about bionic as we go forward. Because now in the past, the way that we thought about the tool and of technology, it was something that we controlled. Now we're entering a new era where the tool itself can now think for itself. And I think that's what makes this moment a little bit different. And so people are starting to think about, will the tool replace us as humans? And so when we're talking about, it's no longer just about automation, but it's actually moving into a space where it's now technology augmenting the way that we work. And so we need to think about some of the practical ways that it's actually going to show up, with this being bionic. And we've got some examples in the healthcare, in the manufacturing and finance and so on. And we can get excited about that.
No, exactly. Let's take a financial example. So I think, let's say you work in an environment where you're giving people wealth management advice, or you're managing their money. I actually think that within a few years, you are going to find clients of those companies saying, I don't want to use your services unless you are using artificial intelligence in the system. Because what can artificial intelligence do? If you are doing stock trading or investment based on models, quantitative models, then you are watching things like share prices and inflection points in graphs and things. And you want to watch every stock market in the world, every stock ticker on every stock market, every second of every day. And what better thing to do that than the technology itself?
Absolutely.
But if you're only making decisions just based on that flash trading, that is one way to do trading, but it's not a way to build a wealth portfolio. And most good wealth managers realize the wealth portfolio is only part of it. The actual trading decision is part of it. The other is, what's your lifestyle? What are the decisions you're making about your life? What are you aiming for? Who else is involved in this? There's a real empathetic element of wealth management these days. And so for me, it's a great example to say, let the machines do what the machines do best. But if you think that it's only about productivity and efficiency, you've misunderstood bionic. You've misunderstood that value. So there's just one example of maybe thinking beyond industrial and information era thinking to this connection thinking of the human using the machine, but still being even, maybe, can we say, more human?
Absolutely. You take the healthcare sector. I mean, doctors are typically overworked, and a lot of that has got to do not so much with what we think most of the work that's taking their time is. It's got to do with the things that actually most doctors and most people in the healthcare and medical profession don't like to do. That's the documenting. That's the admin side of the work. Imagine, and it's already happening, where now with AI diagnostics and systems can analyze and can analyze data and be able to capture live while the consultation is happening. For example, the doctor, instead of now having to go back and record record everything that happened in that interaction, artificial intelligence now can capture all of that information, summarize it, and make sure that now the doctor spends the time as a human doing what only a human can do, and the technology allows. So I think the biggest part of being bionic organization is really going to be about saying, how do we maximize human capacity to deliver on what humans can deliver? So on the creative side, and also make work more exciting and more enjoyable than it was before.
And I think it's also that the label that Jensen used was the connection economy, but that is about relationships, human connection and interaction. So if people are at least moving in the direction of buying the label we're trying to give them, if we're thinking about the organization of the future and we're saying it needs to be bionic, where human and machine are augmenting each other, working in harmony together, it's not about automating people out of the system, but rather letting machines do what they do best, letting people do what they do best, and working well together. What then should people do? Let's get practical. And I know this is something around culture that we talked about even in the last episode.
So as it pertains to organizational design, there are then some practical things that leaders need to do in order to be bionic organizations. And so that has to do with, of course, dealing with some of the practical side of things. We've got to deal with legacy infrastructure that the companies have that now has to be adapted and dealt with. So that's on the practical, physical side of things. But then on the emotional, organizational, culture side of things, we've got to think about the mindset that the whole organization needs to adopt. That's an innovation mindset. We're basically fostering a culture of innovation and continuous improvement, encouraging employees and all stakeholders to experiment with new technologies and start using them. And also, with that, we also have to be thinking about how does this talk to collaboration and being inclusive. And so, yes, collaborating humans to humans, but collaborating humans with machines and technology, as well as promoting an environment where human contribution and machine contribution are valued equally, and diverse perspectives are actually welcomed. And so there is a bit of work to be done on that front, on the organizational side, but also in terms of preparing the teams, the organization, so the skills development that's required to actually take us there. So I think leaders really need to think about the organizational side of things. What are we going to do differently in order to be really and truly bionic? And that work needed to happen yesterday.
This flows nicely into our second point, and I love how you do this, because for you, when we talk about DEI, there's often a rolling of the eyes because I think we've done this quite badly. And I think when DEI is done badly, it just becomes a compliance exercise and it's ticking boxes and so on. But you're not just trying to help people do inclusion and equity and belonging better. You're also linking in that machine side of it as well.
Yes.
Is that we also have to include the machines, if you like, as part of that ecosystem mindset. So the second point we wanted to bring to people today was to say you have to rethink what inclusion and belonging looks like. And I think we probably don't have to convince people that it's being done badly and they should do better, but what are some of the practical things that we could do to rethink inclusion and belonging?
It's really going back to understanding that, diversity is a given. It's not something that we still need to be debating or talking about in that way. What we need to be talking about is how do we leverage the diversity that we already do have? How do we make sure that we're creating a space that actually allows diversity to thrive and diversity to make us more effective and more productive and more successful as an organization, country, whatever scale that you're looking at as a leader. So therefore, creating inclusive environments with belonging at the core is really where we need to be thinking about as leaders. What does that look like? And so I would say that one of the things that I speak about a lot has got to do with the fact that we need to be equipping leaders and our people to be thinking about how they utilize cultural intelligence, for example, as a framework that people are using on a day-to-day basis when they're running meetings, when they're thinking about recruitment, when they're thinking about marketing, so that you are thinking about the other, whatever the other is, and that you are being inclusive in the way that you do everything that you do. And I think for organizations, that means looking at some of our structures, looking at who is in the room, who is not in the room, but it also does speak to how are we equipped to deal with difference, whether it's difference in people, but also difference in terms of technology. Are we inclusive with the technologies that we're going to be using in the organization? So the way that we think about diversity, inclusion, and belonging going forward has to be different and has to be at the core of our organizational design.
And for me, if we rethink DEI in those terms, the outcome then is not just if we can use a provocative term, it's not just a woke organization. It's not just an organization that's ticked all the progressive boxes and can feel good about itself doing that. It's actually an organization that's unlocked things that you and I see every day in companies' vision, mission, value statements. They want innovation, right?
Yes.
Where does innovation come from? It comes from creativity, and that comes from people seeing the same thing but seeing it differently.
Yes, absolutely.
They want resilience, right?
Yes.
How does diversity give us resilience?
Yeah. So again, I think I do have to address sort of like before I go into how it addresses diversity. For those who are listening, we just mentioned the term woke, which is currently used wrongly
correct.
and sort of like misappropriated. And so I do have to address that the current use of that term has completely lost the plot in some ways. But diversity and inclusion really plays a key role in resilience, because again, when we create a psychologically safe environment, it really allows people to be able to bounce back when they deal with difficulties. They know that they are in a space that allows them to thrive through difficulties, that when they face challenges, they have a sense that they are not alone, whoever they are in the organization. So even that can create an environment where people don't crumble when challenges come, because they're in this safe environment where they feel like they belong, regardless of who they are. And so, as a leader, you should want that. You should want to create an organization that, or a space where people actually thrive through adversity and succeed.
Which leads, I've got innovation, resilience, adaptability. That's the other one that's on everybody's list. And I think that's obvious how that flows. So the second thing we need to do, rethink DEI.
Yes.
And do things differently. So then the third thing we wanted to talk about could probably be 10 different things, but let's just lump them all together. Is this adaptability, but then it flows into hybrid working, flexibility, autonomy, and even just simplifying the systems. It's essentially employee empowerment, forget even engagement, but going beyond that to empower people to be able to give their best.
We often talk about this, Graeme, as dealing with limiting orthodoxies, right? So dealing with how our organizations are structured either to make us thrive and be more successful, or are structured to actually make things more difficult for us. And I think often when we think about organizational design, most organizations have inherited ways of working, ways of doing things, and we keep doing them because it's the way we've always done it. And we're not asking the question, why do we do it this way? We don't ask the question, why are we still doing our feedback, feedback interviews this way, or how are we still doing our meetings this way, or why are we still working at the office, for example. And so I think then when it comes to what we've inherited through this period of disruption that we've just gone through, is that we have been challenged to rethink how we work, to rethink flexibility, to rethink autonomy, to rethink all of these things, and to make work more simpler and also agile. And so that's part of the organizational design that's gonna, challenge a lot of
exactly. I love what Keith said about that guy who was trying to find his wedding ring, and he wasn't looking where he lost it, he was just looking where the light was. And I think that's a lot of organizations. They know that probably the systems they're using are not optimal, but at least they understand them and at least they work. And so, if it's not broken, don't fix it is something that people say.
But the key things there, Graeme, on this aspect about how we're structured and how we work is really about what is important for leaders to think about. And so we talk about autonomy as being the important thing. So it's not so much about hybrid. It's not so much about where we work and how many hours we work. It's about what's important. So autonomy, and then the other one was flexibility.
Yeah, a company that I've connected with recently, a company called Multi Health Systems in Canada, has one of the most innovative HR directors I've ever met, Marion Salmon. And they have a wonderful workplace policy, which is that their sort of hybrid work from anywhere, work from home, back to office policy is 100% work from where you work best. Which is a wonderful way of thinking about it. I think when you say autonomy to some people, they think, oh, it's now the Wild West, anything goes, everybody just does whatever they want to do. But what a company like MHS proves is it isn't. Autonomy is about trusting that the people in your team, if you give them the chance to organize their day, their life, their physical space in order to give their best, they will give their best.
Yeah.
Now, if you're thinking, if I give my people freedom to give their best, they're not going to, you've got bigger problems than an office policy.
Absolutely.
And a hybrid policy. And I think people are debating the wrong thing. They, again, looking at the wrong tool and not recognizing the system that they're in. And if we are needing to move through that information age to a connection age, we've got to be thinking about all of these issues. Become more bionic, use our tools better, make sure that diversity and inclusion is just built into the system, that we're listening to everybody and everybody's voice has a chance to shine through. And then autonomy, I think, is the key to all the other things that we talked about there, that we trust people to give their best, and when we give them the space, they don't surprise us, they just rise to the occasion. So those are the rethinks, I think.
Absolutely, and they tie very nicely to both of the interviews that we've just had with our colleagues. So the first one that we had with Dean, that was looking at how strategy needs to be rethought, and also then what we had with Keith, helping us just understand the journey that we've been on and where, sort of like what is next for leaders to think about. And so, there are so many things to think about as a leader. If you want to take this further, go back and listen to those interviews that we've looked at, and great insights for you, for any leader that's listening and connecting with us. In every episode of the Tomorrow Today podcast, we want to bring you a review or a summary of a valuable resource. And in today's episode, Graeme interviewed one of our associates about a book she wrote. Tamryn Batcheller-Adams is a psychologist who also works with corporate leadership teams on issues of team dynamics, executive stress, and leadership. She worked together with two of London Business School's legendary leadership professors, that is David Lewis and Jules Godard, on a book called Mavericks, How Bold Leadership Changes the World. Let's take a listen.
Tam, it's really great to have you here. I love interviewing and speaking to authors, and I really wanted to speak to you about your book, because for me, this book on leadership was not like most leadership books I've read, and I've read a lot of them, because for me it felt like you weren't just speaking to leaders who've got the title or the position of leaders. You wanted to engage everybody and invite them to lead us into a better world. And that second part was also a big theme for me in the book, that it was not about just building a better business or building a better team, but it was building a better world. But anyway, now I'm telling you about your book. So let me hand over to you. What were you trying to do with the book, and what was the sort of behind the scenes? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Graeme. So I came to this process because I was really interested in understanding what allows certain people to persevere in contexts that seem to just push back against them. So obviously, so tangibly, and so personally. What is that kind of resilience component? And I wanted to do a PhD in psychology around that. And I got introduced to David and Jules as just part of a different conversation. And they started talking about the same concept, but from a leadership perspective. And so for the first time, kind of those two links started to join for me around what allows for leaders to think differently, to act differently, and to have essentially a very different philosophical view of leadership, that it's not just about their own positionality, it's not just about their own authority, but it's about making change and change for the betterment of the collective, not just themselves. So the premise behind the book is that there were this kind of idea that the people who lead in this way, people who lead with a very broad systems view, people who are able to shake and change things in their industry, in their business, and in society at large, are wired differently. There's something about how they think and who they are that makes them able to survive a lot of the pushback and resistance that they receive. I mean, anyone who works in a corporate environment who tries to implement change knows about that pushback and that resistance. So we set off as these three different kind of individuals based in different places in the world to try and understand what is it about that mindset that allows these people to be successful in this endeavor. And we interviewed people from a very, very diverse global context, people from different industries, everything from the kind of finance sector to the NGO sector to the government sector, and looked for examples and narratives of people who were doing just that. We came up with this kind of maverick mindset, which really speaks to the hypothesis that there were these key components or key characteristics that did differentiate them. And I suppose the proof was in the pudding. We started to see this kind of pattern of style of thinking, engaging with the world and thinking about others that was fundamentally different. And so all we really did was to analyze their stories, extract some of those kind of themes or do a bit of a thematic analysis, and then kind of overlay that with some psychological and some business theory and understanding. And I suppose package it in what we called the maverick leadership mindset. And the idea behind maverick leaders are that they are people who are resourceful, they are undeterred, they are nonconformist, they are experimental, and all four of those characteristics rest on this bedrock of belief, internal belief, and a belief that the world can be different and that they have a contribution to make in order to let it be so.
In the book, I loved the idea that it was purposeful belief. So it isn't just this vague belief, yes, we can, kind of rah-rah kind of belief that you often, so well, you see it in the movies and you often think that that's what makes a good leader, that sort of vision, mission, value belief. But it was a deep belief that if we did let's do those things again, it was resourceful, non-conformist because you're trying to change a system, experimental because you can't imagine it in advance. You've got to try things and try and succeed and fail sometimes, and then undeterred. And all of those line up to say we can change this system. And that's really the belief you saying that we can build a better world, a better system.
Yeah. I think for me, that was one of the kind of surprise findings, actually, that we didn't expect to unpack in this process, which is that people who we consider to be maverick leaders and people who met this kind of prototype of a leadership philosophy, for them, the professional was personal and the personal was professional. And I think a lot of the time we try and separate those two things out for good reasons. We need boundaries. We don't want things to be blurred. We don't want high levels of burnout, etc. But there was something intricately linked between what they believed about themselves, their own personal values, and how that kind of fueled the work that they were doing. So this concept of the professional being personal and vice versa, I think is quite a powerful one in giving them the kind of internal grit and resilience to sustain the change that they needed to sustain despite the resistance that they met.
And the changes weren't just changes about improving the businesses they've already got. These were all people who were making systems adjustments. So one of my favorite stories in the book, because you tell each of the stories of the people you interviewed, is a person called Guy Singh Watson, who founded a farm called Riverford, or it's actually a group of farms across the UK and in France. And he won Farmer of the Year, or whoever hands out the Farmer of the Year awards, a few times. And he was getting a lot of interest from investors now because he had 600 plus employees and making a hang of a lot of money. But he decided that he was actually going to sell the business to the employees. And I think he kept a minority stake in it. And in the end, yes, you can analyze it via a capitalistic system, because he probably is making more money than he would have if he had just sold the business. But that wasn't the driver at all. And this is just one of many, many stories where you see somebody's working inside an existing system, but they realize that there's a better system available. And as you say, that then will push back against them. They have to have these maverick characteristics about them to push through, but they do. And I mean, I suppose if you had interviewed hundreds of people, you would have had hundreds of examples. Tamryn, what do you think maverick leadership teaches us for today? Why do you think we need maverick leaders everywhere, actually?
Yeah, before I even answer that, I'm going to assume you shared your favorite story. I'm going to share mine. The story of Guy's one is a very powerful one. The one for me that stands out is a story about a woman called Armin Modi, who I've met with personally. So I think that there's a personal touch to that as well. And her story is fascinating because she was currently, at the time, based in Japan. She was in her kind of 50s. She was teaching English and a professor in English. And so really had this kind of academic career that was very much on track. She was Indian by nationality. And she came across an article that spoke about the illiteracy rates of women in India kind of post-independence. And essentially it was still over 50% of women were illiterate, despite independence for over a decade. And she was just flabbergasted by that. And in the middle of her 50s in a foreign country, she just said that it just kind of niggled with her until she decided she had to do something about it. And so at that point, she stopped her career in teaching English and she completely pivoted towards making a fundamental change towards the ecosystem of literacy rates for girls and women in India. She kind of was extremely resourceful in how she did it. And the story unpacks, a really amazing story of how just a single statistic fundamentally changed not only what she was doing, but what she thought was going to be important going forward. And so for me, I think that's why Maverick Leadership is so important. It's a book that reminds us that regardless of our age, regardless of where we're at in our careers, we can still make a really significant difference. I spend a lot of time doing coaching work in corporates and people kind of in their 40s, sometimes in their 50s, feeling like their best years of activism or their best years of action orientation are behind them. And it's just simply not the case. It just needs to be reignited within them. Something needs to spark that again. And so my one hope is that I think the book around Maverick Leadership is a reminder to people that they can still do something, that they can look at this world and actually don't have to feel the sense of resignation or despair, but actually that they have a contribution to make and they can make it in small ways or in big ways. You don't have to change your whole career, but there are lots of opportunities for you to push back against a kind of normative social script or a way of doing things that actually is not to the benefit of the collective. And that could be within your team or your organization or your industry or your community. And I really think that Gen Z brings this quite importantly into the organizational sector. So outside of the NGO space, when I talk to Gen Zs who want purposeful, orientated work, they want work that feels meaningful, they want to work for employees and leaders who are purposeful and intentional around making a difference, this becomes a skill set that actually can't just be ignored going forward.
For me, that's a great connection to what we've been talking about in the connection economy, that the connection economy is not just about optimizing what we've always done in sort of the industrial era mode, or even just applying technologies to solve problems as the digital age did. But the connection economy invites us to rediscover our engagement with communities and collectives, our need to contribute to the world around us in any level of ways, big and small. And Maverick, leadership is the right word, because if people do this, they will influence other people around them, whether they've got a position or a title of leader or not. I knew I'd enjoy this conversation, and I really hope that people are inspired to pick up a copy of the book, get into it, look at those 5 characteristics, see what they can do to develop in themselves and in their teams. Final thoughts from you, maybe for you, what you really hope people will take away from the book.
A point of clarity, I think, that very often when we talk about maverick leadership, people get hung up on the word maverick and they kind of think about the people in the teams that they really don't like, the people who are problematic, the people who are quite destructive. And I think an important differential here is that maverick leaders are rebels with a cause. They are emotionally intelligent. They know how to move things forward, but they do it in a way that is not narcissistic and is not destructive. They do it in a way that is for the collective good. So I think an important takeout here is that when you're thinking about how do you grow maverick leaders in your team for the betterment of your team or organization, hold in mind that you are developing people to be disruptors, but not to be destructive. And I think the book helps to make that differentiation quite clear, which is an important one going forward, especially for HR.
Finding the right people in the future in this connection economy probably means rethinking the type of people that we want. Maverick, make sure you get a copy of it. I'm sure you'll find it valuable, insightful, and part of your journey as a leader in moving into this new connection economy. Tamryn, thank you very much.
Thanks, Graeme.
So, what questions should we be asking as leaders faced with the reality of a changing landscape that calls for new organizational design and that calls for how our organizations are structured to be different? So let's try 3 questions that we can look at as we wrap up this episode. Firstly, is the way that we operate today geared towards the future of our industry or the past that is no longer serving us? And if so, what parts of our business needs transformation and how will we go about making the required changes to take place?
When that first question about are we future focused or are we protecting what we've already got, it's a really difficult question for leaders to answer themselves. There's no leader I've met who thinks, oh, I'm stuck in the past or anything. They might be frustrated with their organizations, but hopefully what they're hearing from us and what they will continue to hear over the rest of this limited series as we look at aspects in the next few episodes of the podcast around leadership, and in fact the next episode is very much about future trends and disruption, is they will understand that the disruptions that are coming are not just making their current business maybe slightly more difficult to run, put more effort in, keep doing what you're doing, but make it slightly better, slightly cheaper. We're at this moment in history where there's deep structural change taking place. Yeah. Those grey elephants we referred to with the Dean in the previous episode. And so it really is a bigger question than maybe leaders give themselves time to think about. Are you geared towards the future? And if so, what does that actually look like in your business? Explain what that means. The answer is yes, I'm definitely future focused. And then we will push back and say, but what does that look like in your leadership structure, in the agenda of your executive team and the activities that you do? So you said there were 3 questions. That's the first one. Love it.
Yeah. Well, the second question is really, what are we going to do to prepare our organization to be a bionic business? Very straightforward. So what are some of the implications? I spoke about legacy infrastructure. When you think about processes, when we think about equipping our workforce with skills and knowledge to succeed in a bionic business environment. So these are practical things that leaders need to be asking and thinking about.
And I suppose the only thing I'd add to that question is you don't want to view it as a discrete change process. Yes. In other words, I recognize that we're not quite as bionic as we should be. Let's get everybody up to speed. Everybody goes on a ChatGPT training course. Everybody goes on a machine learning 3-day intensive masterclass. Okay, then off you go. We've got to realize that business and the business environment, and that includes the political environment, the social environment, the cultural environment, are all of those things: bionic, diverse, integrated or autonomous, and we've got to actually build that adaptability into our development systems as well.
Absolutely.
So it's not a case of going from point A to point B, then tick the box, you're there. It's recognizing we've got to build the ability to constantly update, experiment, change things, become more bionic constantly. Bionic. The third
and
thing.
the third one, well, it speaks to the aspects that we just touched on. So the redefinitions of how we work. So what are some of the redefinitions of how we work we need to embrace to become more flexible, bionic, inclusive, and adaptable, and sustainable organizations going into the future? And we've purposely thrown a lot at you in these last 2 episodes, and it will require you to spend some time thinking it over and thinking over the concepts that we've shared with you and how they will impact your leadership into the future.
So, thanks for listening to another episode. This is episode 3 of the Tomorrow Today podcast. We hope you found it insightful and helpful on your leadership journey and your business journey. So go ahead and look at the show notes. We've given you a number of resources. There's some book recommendations. Take your time to digest what you've heard from us. Follow us also on the social media links that we've provided. We continually provide additional resources, especially now in the time that we are launching this podcast. And remember to subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening to us right now, and give us a review as well if you've enjoyed these first few episodes. We'll see you in the next episode of the Tomorrow Today podcast, where we'll continue to map the future of business.